Have you ever had that strange feeling that something was going to happen, and it seemed impossible to ignore? It wasn't a rational thought. It wasn't accompanied by evidence, data, or clear explanations. It was just a silent, almost unsettling certainty that arose from nowhere and settled in his mind as if it were warning him. Pay attention, your heart races a little. Your body goes on alert. And no matter how hard you try to push it away, that feeling lingers, persistent, as if your own brain is trying to prepare you for something that hasn't happened yet. Have you ever experienced this? Perhaps it was a connection you knew wouldn't be good. Or that strange feeling before a date, a trip, an important decision. Sometimes it's just a vague discomfort. At other times, it's almost an absolute conviction that something is about to happen, good or bad. And the most disturbing thing is that this feeling seems real, intense, urgent, as if ignoring it would be a mistake. What few people realize is that this experience doesn't just happen in the mind. It happens throughout the entire body. Breathing changes, muscles tense, focus narrows. It's as if, for a few seconds, the world around you loses importance and everything concentrates on that silent prediction that didn't ask permission to appear. And at that moment, the question ceases to exist. Does that make sense? And it becomes, what if I'm right? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, and perhaps change the way you interpret these internal signals. The feeling of, this is going to happen, is often mistaken for intuition, a sixth sense, or even some kind of special perception. But before placing this phenomenon on a mystical pedestal, it's worth looking at something far more fascinating: how the human brain works when it tries to predict the future. Because, contrary to what we like to believe, the brain is not an impartial judge of reality. It is a strategist, an anticipator of scenarios, a machine obsessed with patterns, probabilities, and coherent narratives. And this is where the discomfort begins. The brain hates uncertainty. It prefers a wrong answer to no answer at all. It prefers an imperfect explanation to a void of information. So, when it perceives ambiguous signals, subtle changes in the environment, intense emotions, old memories, past experiences, it does what it does best. It builds a prediction. Quick, automatic, convincing, and often misleading. You don't feel this prediction as a calculation. You feel it as a certainty. And that's exactly what makes it all so powerful, and so dangerous. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you looked back and thought, I knew? How many times has this phrase been laden with pride, fear, or regret? The brain loves these narratives because they reinforce the idea of control. The idea that, somehow, we are ahead of events. But what we almost never analyze is the other side, all the times this feeling arose, and absolutely nothing happened. These memories rarely gain prominence. They fade away. They are discarded, as if they never existed. It is in this uncomfortable territory, between perception, emotion, and brain error, that the proposal of dark human science makes sense. Not to offer easy answers, but to explore the gray areas of the human mind, where the brain creates certainties before reality has a chance to manifest itself. So tell me, when you feel that something is going to happen, who is really speaking? Reality, or a brain desperate to predict the next chapter? Now, before moving on, hold on to that feeling. Observe how it arises, how it grows, and how it seems to want to convince you of something. Because, from here, we're going to delve into the invisible mechanism that transforms uncertainty into conviction, and that's where things start to get really interesting. As you listen to all this, perhaps some memory has already begun to stir within you. Some specific moment when this feeling appeared without warning, took over your thoughts and kept hammering away as if trying to tell you something. Each person experiences this in a different way, and that's exactly why this conversation doesn't end here, it builds together. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It could be a hunch that stuck with you, a feeling that's hard to explain, or even a question that came up while you were watching. When you write, you're not just talking to me, you're opening up space for other people to recognize themselves in your experience. And sometimes, reading someone else's account helps more than any scientific explanation. If at any point you've thought, this has happened to me before, consider liking the video. This simple gesture signals that this type of content matters, that it's worthwhile to delve deeper, investigate, and continue exploring these strange areas of the human mind. That's how this message reaches more people who also experience these sensations in silence, thinking they're the only ones. And if you feel genuine curiosity about understanding the brain, the subtle errors of perception, and those phenomena that lie between reason and sensation, subscribe to the channel. Not as an automatic click, but as a conscious choice to continue this journey. Your participation here is what makes this space grow and allows this type of conversation, deep, uncomfortable, and necessary, to continue to exist. Think of it as an exchange. You bring your questions, your experiences, your concerns, and, together, we dismantle those internal certainties that seem so solid, but hide much more complex mechanisms behind them. Now that you recognize that feeling of, this is going to happen, it's time to understand exactly what the brain is doing behind the scenes when it arises. And that's where the story starts to get even more unsettling. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because what you feel, that strange, almost unsettling feeling that something is about to happen, is not an isolated event, nor a rare personality trait. It's not a sign of emotional fragility or excessive sensitivity. On the contrary, it's an extremely common human experience, shared by people of different ages, cultures, life stories, and levels of rationality. Highly analytical people feel it. Skeptical people feel it. People who rely heavily on logic feel it, and often become even more disconcerted precisely because they can't explain it. The feeling of foreboding often arises without warning. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't announce itself. It simply appears like an internal noise that says, something is out of place. And the most curious thing is that, when this happens, we rarely manage to pinpoint the reason. There is no clear fact, no objective evidence. There is only a sudden, silent certainty that imposes itself as if it came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Something is wrong, but I can't explain it. This phrase, spoken or thought, crosses the minds of millions of people every day. This type of experience creates a powerful internal conflict. On one hand, reason demands calm, data, facts, context. On the other, the body and mind react as if they have already understood something that has not yet been verbalized. The heart races, attention shifts, the perception of the environment transforms. It's as if you enter a state of readiness, even without knowing exactly why. And it is at this point that many people begin to doubt themselves. Am I exaggerating? Am I creating something where there is nothing? Or am I ignoring an important signal? This dilemma is not new. It has accompanied humanity for centuries because it touches on something very sensitive: the way we make decisions. When we feel that this is going to happen, we are pushed towards different choices. Sometimes we avoid certain paths. Sometimes we accelerate our movements. Sometimes we retreat without understanding why. These seemingly small micro-decisions shape entire trajectories. They affect relationships, opportunities, risks taken or avoided. The impact can be subtle or profound, but it is almost never neutral. The problem is that the brain doesn't deliver this feeling with an error message. It doesn't say, attention, this is just a provisional interpretation. On the contrary, it delivers this perception forcefully, with conviction, with an emotional tone that makes everything seem urgent. And urgency is a powerful language. When something seems urgent, critical thinking weakens. The mind goes into action mode. The transformation happens too quickly to be analyzed calmly. And here's a crucial point that almost no one mentions: this feeling doesn't choose context. It can arise in mundane moments, like before a simple conversation, or in decisive situations such as a career choice, an investment, or a major change. It also doesn't respect history. It can appear even when everything seems to be going well. That's precisely when it's most frightening, because it breaks the comfortable narrative that the brain had been building up until then. Therefore, it's not uncommon for people to try to give this experience a special name: intuition, sixth sense, inner alert, inner voice. Giving it a name helps to deal with the discomfort. It gives a sense of control. But by doing this too quickly, we skip an essential step: understanding what's going on behind the scenes. Understanding what's really happening behind this certainty without proof. Which mental mechanism was activated? Which cognitive shortcut came into play? What hidden truth is being constructed there, not by external reality, but by the internal dynamics of the mind? The brain is a storyteller. It takes loose fragments, an old memory, a recent emotion, an almost imperceptible detail of the environment, and stitches them all together into a coherent narrative. This narrative doesn't need to be true. It just needs to make enough sense to reduce the feeling of uncertainty. And when this internal story forms too quickly, it comes accompanied by this strange conviction: this will happen. The most intriguing thing is that, most of the time, we don't question this story when it arises. We question it later, when something goes wrong, or when something goes right and reinforces the belief that, I knew it. The brain learns more from the emotional impact of the outcome than from the accuracy of the process. And this creates a silent cycle, where certain sensations gain the status of a reliable signal, even when they originated from flawed interpretations. This phenomenon subtly but constantly permeates the human journey. It influences mindset, shapes perceptions, and directly interferes with how we interpret the world. It's not about completely denying these sensations, nor about blindly accepting them. It's about understanding. Because understanding changes everything. Understanding restores autonomy. Understanding allows us to observe instead of reacting. When you recognize that this sudden certainty is neither a rare gift nor a personal flaw, something changes. The experience ceases to be frightening and becomes something to investigate. It transforms into an invitation to curiosity, not fear. An invitation to look inward and perceive how the brain constructs meaning in real time, often without consulting us. And the more you observe this process, the more you realize that it's not just about predicting the future. It's about how we deal with uncertainty, how we seek security, how we try to maintain internal coherence in an unpredictable world. It's about decisions, emotional impact, silent transformation, and how we create meaning to keep moving forward. All of this happens even before you formulate a clear thought. The story is already being written behind the scenes. And understanding these behind-the-scenes events is what allows you to see beyond sensation, beyond automatic narrative, beyond immediate conviction. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand why this feeling of "this will happen" seems so convincing, we need to face a truth that isn't always comfortable. The human brain wasn't designed to seek the truth. This may sound strange at first glance, almost provocative, but it completely changes how you perceive your own thoughts, decisions, and inner certainties. The brain's primary function has never been to be an impartial judge of reality. It doesn't exist to calmly analyze the world, weigh evidence, and arrive at the most accurate conclusion possible. This idea is relatively recent in human history. The brain emerged, evolved, and refined itself for another, far more urgent mission: survival. And survival, most of the time, doesn't require absolute precision. It requires speed. It requires anticipation. It requires the ability to foresee what might go wrong before it does. In hostile, unpredictable, and risky environments, waiting for the whole truth could be fatal. It was better to be wrong fast than to be right too late. It was better to imagine a non-existent threat than to ignore a real danger. This simple principle profoundly shaped the human mindset. And it continues to operate today, even in a world that no longer resembles the one in which our brains were formed. When you feel that something is going to happen, what's at play isn't a special gift or a strange flaw. It's an ancient mechanism refined over thousands of years that attempts to reduce uncertainty by creating anticipated scenarios. The brain observes patterns, cross-references incomplete information, accesses past memories, and projects a possible future. Not because that future is real, but because it needs to be ready to react if it is. And here's a crucial point. For the brain, prediction is more important than accuracy. Anticipating patterns has always been a survival strategy. Identifying subtle changes in the environment, in the behavior of others, or even in one's own body allowed one to react before it was too late. The problem is that this system hasn't been updated to the emotional, social, and symbolic complexity of modern life. It continues to function with the same basic logic, but now applied to situations that don't involve predators or immediate physical threats. This means that the brain treats uncertainty as risk. Whenever there are gaps in information, it tries to fill them. Whenever something is unclear, it constructs a provisional narrative. And the more ambiguous the situation, the greater the chance that it will resort to mental shortcuts. These shortcuts are not conscious. They happen behind the scenes, outside the direct reach of rational perception. When the result reaches consciousness, it already comes packaged as a ready-made feeling. A hunch, a certainty, an alert. That's why this experience feels so powerful. You don't follow the process. You only receive the final product. The conscious mind doesn't see the improvised calculations, the vague associations, the emotions mixed with memories. It only receives the conclusion. And, like any conclusion, it comes with an emotional weight that gives it a sense of truth. This dynamic has a profound impact on the decisions we make. Many important choices don't stem from cold analysis, but from this anticipatory impulse. A conversation avoided. An opportunity refused. A risk taken without knowing exactly why. The brain presents this prediction as silent advice. And when we follow this advice, we feel relief. When we ignore it, we feel discomfort. This reinforces the idea that this inner voice deserves trust. But here emerges the hidden truth that is rarely discussed. The brain doesn't evaluate whether the prediction is true, it evaluates whether it is consistent with the existing internal narrative. Whether it makes sense with past experiences, current emotions and future expectations. Internal consistency matters more than correspondence with external reality. And this explains why two people can experience the same situation and have completely opposite premonitions. This tendency to predict is not a flaw. It's a legacy. It has shaped the human journey and continues to influence our behavior in profound and silent ways. The problem arises when we confuse this mechanism with privileged access to the future. When we give these predictions a status they don't have. When we let them dictate our decisions without question. Understanding this doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, or disconnected from your own emotions. On the contrary, it means gaining awareness. It means observing how the brain works, what patterns it prioritizes, how it reacts to uncertainty. This observation is, in itself, a form of transformation. It changes the relationship you have with your thoughts. Instead of being dragged along by them, you begin to walk alongside them. The more you understand that prediction is a survival strategy, the clearer it becomes that not every sense of urgency deserves immediate obedience. Some deserve attention. Others only curiosity. And still others are just noise, a byproduct of a system that prefers exaggeration to being caught off guard. This is one of the great paradoxes of the human mind. The same mechanism that protects us can also deceive us. The same impulse that saves us in extreme situations can distort perception in complex context. And it is at this point that a real change in mindset begins. When you realize that not every internal certainty carries an external truth, something shifts. The relationship with fear changes. The relationship with the future changes. The relationship with one's own decisions becomes more conscious. The brain will continue trying to predict. That won't stop. But the way you interpret those predictions can change completely. And that change doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, through daily observation, constant curiosity, and a willingness to question what seems too obvious. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because here we touch on the heart of it all. It is precisely at this point that the feeling of, "this will happen," ceases to be merely curious and begins to reveal a silent, sophisticated, and extremely convincing brain error. An error that doesn't shout, doesn't warn, and doesn't present itself as doubt. On the contrary, it manifests itself as certainty. The brain confuses probability with certainty all the time. And it does so with frightening ease. It only takes a few signs to align, even if they are weak, incomplete, or ambiguous, for a possibility to begin to gain emotional weight. When this happens, the mind stops treating that scenario as something that can happen and begins to feel it as something fater it happens. Not because the data supports it, but because the brain decided that that story makes enough sense to be concluded. And this decision isn't rational. It arises from the combination of small signs with strong emotions. A different tone of voice. An unusual delay. A detail out of the ordinary. An old memory that returns without a clear context. All of this, in isolation, means almost nothing. But when these fragments encounter a specific emotional state, anxiety, expectation, fear, attachment, they merge into something much larger. Emotion acts as an amplifier. It gives volume to what was just noise. The problem is that the brain doesn't signal this process as a guess. It delivers the result as conviction. The feeling comes ready-made, polished, with an internal sense of urgency that says, "Pay attention to this." And because emotion is involved, questioning this certainty starts to seem dangerous. Ignoring it seems irresponsible. Doubting it seems naive. That's how a probability becomes an internal truth. This mechanism exists because the brain hates open-ended stories. It dislikes undefined endings. Whenever possible, it tries to close the narrative. It prefers an incomplete explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers a hasty conclusion to an uncomfortable wait. So, faced with little data, it fills in the rest based on past experiences, learned patterns, and future expectations. The result is a coherent story, but not necessarily a true one. This premature closure of the story is one of the most invisible backstage workings of the human mind. It happens too quickly to be consciously perceived. When you notice, the story is already finished. The script has already been written, and you are merely reacting to it. That's why the feeling of "this is going to happen" seems so solid. It doesn't arrive as a question. It arrives as a statement. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the faster this shutdown happens. In moments of transformation, decision, or vulnerability, the brain enters maximum protection mode. It tries to reduce uncertainty at all costs. And the cost often is accuracy. It accepts the risk of being wrong to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. This exchange happens automatically, without consultation, without warning. The impact of this on one's personal journey is enormous. Many important decisions are not made based on facts, but on internal narratives that have already been closed before reality manifests. The mind acts as if it is anticipating the future, when in fact it is only reacting to a well-constructed internal narrative. A narrative that seems logical internally, but that may be completely misaligned with what will actually happen. And here's an even more unsettling detail. When by chance this prediction comes true, the brain registers the success with full force. It marks that moment as proof, as evidence, as reinforcement of its own strategy. But when the prediction fails, which happens much more frequently, the brain minimizes, ignores, or simply erases it. This imbalance creates the illusion of competence. The illusion that, I'm usually right. This is one of the mind's great tricks. It's not that you get it right more often than you get it wrong. It's that you remember the right things more than the wrong ones. And this selective memory strengthens confidence in future experiences. A cycle is formed. A silent, elegant, and deceptive cycle. Do you see how this changes everything? The feeling of this is going to happen ceases to be a mystical mystery and becomes a revelation about how the brain deals with uncertainty, emotion, and control. It doesn't arise because you saw the future. It arises because the brain decided it can't wait any longer for it. This realization triggers a subtle shift in mindset. Instead of fighting these feelings or blindly submitting to them, you begin to observe them. You start to notice when the story was closed too soon, when a few signs gained too much weight, when emotion took the wheel before the data arrived. This doesn't eliminate the phenomenon. The brain will continue to do it. It always has. It always will. But consciousness transforms the relationship. The sensation loses some of its absolute power. It ceases to be an order and becomes information. An internal datum, not a decree. And it is precisely at this point that something begins to shift. Because when you understand that this internal certainty is often a probability inflated by emotion, you gain space to choose. To choose to pause. To choose to observe. To choose not to close the story so quickly. This is a silent but profound transformation. It changes how you approach decisions, premonitions, and even the fear of what hasn't happened yet. It reveals that often what seems like a warning from the future is just the echo of a brain desperately trying to keep everything under control. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why does this feeling seem so real and so urgent? It completely changes the way you perceive your own thoughts. It's no exaggeration to say that at this point, the brain stops merely suggesting possibilities and begins to impose narratives. And the central reason for this lies not in the facts, nor in the external signs, it lies in the emotions. When anxiety, fear, or anticipation enter the scene, the brain shifts gears. It leaves analytical mode in the background and activates a much older, faster, and more instinctive system. In this state, predicting is not just a strategy, it's a necessity. Uncertainty begins to be perceived as a threat, and the mind does everything to eliminate it as quickly as possible. That's when that feeling of, this is going to happen, gains strength, volume, and urgency. Anxiety, for example, doesn't create predictions out of thin air. It amplifies them. It takes a small possibility and transforms it into something that seems imminent. An irrelevant detail becomes a sign. A silence becomes an alert. A delay becomes confirmation. The mind begins to fill in gaps with emotionally charged hypotheses, and the more anxiety there is, the less room there is for doubt. The feeling doesn't come with maybe. It comes with now. Fear does something similar but even more intensely. It's not interested in probability, it wants to avoid pain. So, faced with any ambiguous scenario, the brain tilts the prediction toward the worst possible outcome. Not because it's the most likely but because it's the safest from a survival standpoint. If the danger doesn't exist, great. But if it does exist and you ignore it, the cost could be too high. This primitive logic continues to operate even when the risk isn't physical, but emotional, social, or symbolic. Expectation, on the other hand, creates a different but equally powerful effect. When you expect a lot from something, a result, an answer, a change, the brain begins to simulate that future repeatedly. It rehearses scenarios, anticipations, reactions. And the more times the simulation happens, the more familiar that future seems. Familiarity generates a sense of reality. What was just a possible scenario begins to be felt as something almost concrete, almost inevitable. In all these cases, emotion acts as a seal of authenticity. It gives the prediction a sense of absolute truth. Not because the prediction is correct but because it is felt intensely. The brain confuses emotional intensity with validity. The stronger the feeling, the truer it seems. And this is one of the most subtle and impactful errors of the human mind. That's why, when this feeling arises, it seems impossible to ignore. It's not just a thought you can analyze coldly. It's an internal state that takes over the entire body. The chest tightens. The stomach reacts. Attention narrows. Everything points in the same direction. Questioning this feeling requires cognitive effort at a time when the brain is precisely trying to conserve energy. This is the point where many people say, "I know it seems irrational, but it's very powerful." And that statement is extremely honest. Because, in fact, the feeling doesn't originate in the realm of reason. It originates in the realm of emotion. And emotion doesn't debate. Emotion convinces. There's also a time factor involved. Intense emotions accelerate the process of closing the story. The brain doesn't just create a narrative, it creates it quickly. It skips steps. It ignores alternatives. It disregards data that hasn't yet arrived. All to quickly reach a conclusion that brings relief, even if temporary. The urgency doesn't come from external reality. It comes from the internal need to end the uncertainty. And the more emotionally involved you are in a situation, the more convincing that certainty becomes. Not because you're seeing something others aren't, but because the brain is operating under pressure. Emotional pressure. Psychological pressure. Narrative pressure. It wants to resolve the tension, not discover the truth. This mechanism explains why intelligent, critical, and rational people also fall into this trap. It's not a lack of logic. It's an excess of emotion in the system. And emotion doesn't need arguments to dominate, it only needs personal relevance. If something touches your history, your fears, your desires, or your expectations, the brain goes into maximum protection mode. At some point in this journey, this feeling begins to seem almost like an identity. I am like this, I feel it beforehand. But this is a dangerous conclusion because it transforms an automatic brain process into a fixed personality trait. And when that happens, the person stops observing the phenomenon and begins to obey it. The narrative ceases to be questioned. It is precisely in this space that awareness begins to make a difference. Not to eliminate emotion, but to see it in action. To perceive when it is inflating a possibility until it seems like a certainty. To notice when the urgency comes more from the mind than from the world. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not to deny what you feel, but to reveal the inner workings of how those sensations are constructed. Because understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the impact of the experience. It only takes away the sheer power it seems to possess. When you realize that this urgency stems from emotion, something changes. The feeling still appears, but it no longer arrives as an order. It arrives as a signal. An internal signal that can be observed, contextualized, and, most importantly, slowed down. This small space between feeling and acting changes everything. It transforms reaction into choice. Automatism into awareness. Pressure into possibility. This is a silent shift in mindset. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually as you begin to recognize the pattern. As you realize that the more intense the emotion, the more suspicious the certainty should be. Not to ignore it, but to investigate it. And this investigation opens up space for something even deeper because when you start to separate emotion from prediction, an inevitable question arises. Why do we remember so much the times when we were right, and almost never the countless times when that feeling arose and led to nothing? Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where one of the most elegant and most dangerous mental tricks of the human brain takes place. A trick so well executed that, most of the time, it goes completely unnoticed. It is at this point that the feeling of "this will happen" ceases to be just an internal experience and begins to transform into a solid belief about who you are and how the world works. The brain is not a neutral archivist. It doesn't record everything in the same way. It selects, edits, and prioritizes what reinforces the narrative that is already being constructed. When a hunch happens, when the prediction is confirmed by coincidence, context, or simple chance, the brain shines a spotlight on it. This moment gains emotional prominence. It is recorded intensely. It becomes a strong, accessible, almost vivid memory. And later, when you think about that kind of feeling, that's the episode that comes to mind first. But when the hunch doesn't come true, when that inner certainty leads nowhere, when the event doesn't happen, when the fear was unfounded or the expectation exaggerated, the brain does the exact opposite. It minimizes it. It dilutes it. It pushes it to the back of memory. There isn't enough emotion to fix that experience. There's no interesting narrative to sustain it. The episode disappears without a trace. This imbalance creates something powerful, the illusion of reliability. It seems like you get it right more often than you get it wrong, when in reality you just remember the right ones more than the wrong ones. The mind constructs a false statistic based on selective memory. And this false statistic begins to guide future decisions, further reinforcing the belief in one's own gut feeling. This is a silent turning point in many people's mental journey. Gradually, the person begins to trust their feelings more than analysis. More intuition fueled by emotion than careful observation. Not because it's rational, but because it's comfortable. Comfortable to believe that there's an internal radar working well. That there's some kind of perceptual advantage. That the brain knows beforehand. And here's a disconcerting detail. The more you believe it, the more your brain seeks confirmation. It pays attention to any sign that validates this narrative. Small successes become giant proofs. Big mistakes become exceptions. The system feeds on itself. The mindset adjusts to protect the belief, not to test reality. This mechanism has a profound impact on everyday decisions. Relationships are interrupted by hunches that would never be confirmed. Opportunities are avoided because of fears that only existed in the mind. Paths are chosen not because they were the most coherent, but because they seemed inevitable at that moment. The brain calls this prudence. But often, it is just a reaction to a poorly told internal story. The mini psychological shock happens when you realize this clearly. When you realize that it's not that your hunches are special, it's that your memory is selective. It's not that you have a gift for predicting the future. It's that the brain is extremely efficient at forgetting what doesn't reinforce the narrative. This revelation is usually unsettling because it takes away something precious. The feeling of control. The human mind craves control. It likes to believe it can anticipate, avoid, and prepare. And gut feeling offers exactly that, the sensation of being one step ahead. Questioning this mechanism is uncomfortable because it exposes a hidden truth about our vulnerability in the face of uncertainty. It shows that often we are not predicting anything. We are merely reacting to misinterpreted emotions. This perception, however, is not negative. It is liberating. Because when you understand that the brain makes big mistakes with the same confidence with which it gets things right, something adjusts internally. Internal certainty loses some of its absolute brilliance. It begins to be seen as a hypothesis, not as destiny. And this changes the emotional impact of decisions. You start to notice how many times that feeling arose, and nothing happened. How many times your body went on alert for no real reason. How many times the story was closed too soon. This kind of observation doesn't erase the past, but it reconfigures the present. It changes how you interpret future experiences. The journey ceases to be guided by fear or inflated expectations and becomes guided by conscious curiosity. This change in mindset doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually as you begin to pay attention not only to the successes, but also to the silences, to the false alarms, to the stories that led nowhere. And little by little, you realize that blindly trusting your gut feeling wasn't a sign of strength, it was merely a side effect of a brain trying to simplify a complex world. This doesn't mean ignoring everything you feel. It means giving those feelings their proper place. Neither on a pedestal nor in the trash. Just in the field of observation. As internal data that may or may not be relevant. As clues, not as final judgments. And when you reach that point, something curious happens. The mind begins to slow down. The urgency diminishes. The space between feeling and acting increases. And in that space, new possibilities for choice emerge, new interpretations, new revelations about how you truly function. That's exactly where the most delicate part of this journey begins. Understanding why the brain insists so much on protecting these internal narratives, even when they don't correspond to reality, and what happens when you start to dismantle this mechanism piece by piece. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why do we only remember the successes. This is the point where curiosity turns into intellectual fascination. It's here that many people have that silent, almost uncomfortable realization that the problem was never just the hunch itself, but the way the brain chooses what to remember and what to forget. Human memory doesn't function as a faithful archive of reality. It's selective, interpretive, and deeply interested in protecting the narrative you've constructed about yourself and the world. The brain doesn't ask, what really happened? He asks, what makes the most sense to remember? And for him, making sense almost always means maintaining coherence, identity, and control. When a hunch is confirmed, that event takes on a special status. It's not just recorded as a fact but as proof. Proof that you perceived signs. Proof that you felt it beforehand. Proof that that feeling was well-founded. The emotion associated with the correct prediction acts as a powerful chemical marker, vividly recording that memory. It becomes accessible, easy to retrieve, ready to be used as an internal argument in the future. But mistakes are handled very differently. When a hunch doesn't come true, there's no emotional reward. There's no relief, no validation, no sense of control. On the contrary, there's frustration, embarrassment, or simple indifference. The brain, always economical, quickly understands that this type of memory doesn't serve to strengthen the narrative. So it does what it knows best, it lets it disappear. This process is not conscious. You don't decide to forget. The mind simply doesn't prioritize that information. It doesn't revisit it. It doesn't reinforce it. It doesn't transform it into history. Over time, that episode becomes a blur or disappears completely. And when you look back trying to assess whether your hunches work, what appears are only the most striking successes. This is the heart of selective memory. It's not that you get more things right than wrong. It's that the brain constructs a biased retrospective, an emotionally convenient summary, an edited past. This mechanism is directly connected to confirmation bias. Once you start believing your hunches are reliable, the brain actively seeks evidence to support that belief. It pays more attention to signs that confirm it. It interprets neutral events as validation. It ignores or rationalizes anything that contradicts it. Reality is not fairly assessed, it is filtered. This filter has a huge impact on mindset. Gradually, the belief ceases to be, sometimes I feel things, and it becomes, when I feel it, it's because something is about to happen. This change is subtle but profound. It transforms an occasional experience into identity. An identity is something the brain fiercely defends. When a belief becomes part of who you are, questioning it starts to generate discomfort. So the brain works behind the scenes to avoid this discomfort. It edits the past, adjusts details, reorganizes memories, all to keep the narrative intact. This editing is not deliberate lying, it's psychological self-protection. And the more times this cycle repeats, the stronger it becomes. With each new correct prediction, the belief solidifies. With each forgotten mistake, the system gains more confidence. The brain begins to act as if it has an impressive track record of correct predictions, even if, statistically, this is not true. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the human mind. It doesn't seek historical accuracy, it seeks emotional coherence. The past is not a fixed record, it's a continuous construction. It changes according to the needs of the present. And, in this process, many important revelations end up buried. When you realize this, something changes in the way you look at your own certainties. You start to question not only what do I remember, but what don't I remember? What premonitions arose that led nowhere? How many times have you felt urgency for no real reason? How many internal stories were closed, and then simply forgotten? This reflection often causes a slight internal upheaval. Not because it invalidates your experience but because it shifts the axis of trust. Trust ceases to be based on raw sensation and begins to be based on observing the process. This is a silent but powerful transformation. It changes your relationship with decisions, with fear, with expectation, and with the future itself. The hidden truth here is that the brain doesn't want to be precise. It wants to be comfortable with its own story. And understanding this doesn't make you colder or more distant. It makes you more aware. More capable of navigating between sensation and reality without getting lost in automatic narratives. This level of awareness doesn't eliminate cognitive bias. It doesn't disappear. But it becomes perceptible. And everything that is perceived loses some of the invisible power it had before. The feeling of this will happen ceases to be a prophecy and becomes an internal fact, subject to analysis, context, and pause. When you reach this point in the journey, an even deeper question begins to emerge. If the brain edits the past to protect the narrative, what happens when you start looking at that narrative without trying to protect it? What other distortions appear? What other certainties begin to waver? It is precisely in this territory that understanding brain error ceases to be merely interesting and becomes transformative, because it opens up space for a completely different relationship with what you feel, think, and decide. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because it is precisely here that the most delicate question of this entire mental journey arises. Is what you feel intuition, or just an elegant error of the brain? This question is unsettling because it doesn't allow for simple answers. It doesn't fit into extremes. And perhaps the biggest mistake is precisely trying to place it in one of them. Not all intuition is false. It's important to make that clear. The brain is indeed capable of picking up subtle patterns, recurrences, and regularities that the conscious mind hasn't yet organized into words. Accumulated experience, repeated exposure to certain contexts, and implicit learning create a kind of refined sensitivity. In some situations, this sensitivity manifests as a quick and silent perception that seems to arise from nowhere, but carries real information. To deny this would be dishonest. At the same time, not all certainty is reliable. And that's where things start to get slippery. The problem isn't feeling something. The problem is the absolute conviction that often accompanies that feeling. The human mind has difficulty dealing with gradations. It prefers, it is, or it isn't. It prefers the definitive to the provisional. So, when a feeling arises, it tends to be interpreted as a clear sign, as an objective message, as revealed truth, even when it originated from fragile mental shortcuts. Most of these feelings of "this is going to happen" don't stem from a real prediction of the future. They arise from automatic processes that attempt to simplify reality. The brain takes incomplete information, mixes it with intense emotions, cross-references it with recent or old memories, and delivers a quick result. This result doesn't come labeled as a hypothesis. It comes packaged as certainty because that's functional. It reduces doubt. It reduces anxiety. It gives a sense of control. This is where many people get lost. Not because they trust their intuition, but because they confuse speed with depth. They confuse intensity with truth. They confuse familiarity with precision. When something is felt strongly, it automatically seems more true. But emotional strength is not a criterion of reality. It's a criterion of internal relevance. There is a subtle yet crucial difference between intuition and inflated certainty. Genuine intuition is usually silent, open, and doesn't demand immediate obedience. It suggests. It points things out. It leaves room for questioning. False conviction, on the other hand, comes with urgency, with pressure, with an inner tone that says, "Don't think, act." This difference is almost never explained, but it completely changes how you deal with what you feel. The brain loves mental shortcuts because they save energy. Evaluating all possibilities, weighing data, sustaining doubt for too long is tiring. So it creates shortcuts. These shortcuts work well in many simple everyday situations, but fail in complex, ambiguous, or emotionally charged contexts. And modern life is practically made up of only that. The brain's elegant error lies precisely there. It doesn't fail grotesquely. It fails convincingly. It creates plausible narratives. It connects real dots but in a rushed manner. It delivers a story that seems to make sense internally, even when it doesn't hold up externally. And because this story is accompanied by emotion, it imposes itself with authority. This elegance of error is what makes it so difficult to perceive. There's no alarm saying, "Attention, this is just a mental shortcut." There's no warning that important data hasn't arrived yet. There's only the feeling. Clean, direct, convincing, and often frighteningly comfortable. When you understand this, you don't need to go into denial or throw away everything you feel. On the contrary, you begin to create a more mature relationship with your own mind. A relationship based on observation, not submission. You start to ask yourself, is this feeling offering me information, or is it just trying to reduce my anxiety? Does it broaden my perspective, or narrow my options? This approach changes the impact of decisions. You don't freeze. You don't ignore. You pause. And this pause, however small, is transformative. It creates space between impulse and action, between automatic narrative and conscious choice. It is in this space that the mindset truly begins to change. The most interesting thing is that, when you start doing this, you realize that many of these inner certainties lose their power on their own. Not because you fought against them, but because you stopped feeding them with immediate obedience. Some dissolve. Others prove irrelevant. And a few resist. These indeed deserve more careful attention. This process doesn't make you more disconnected from the world. It makes you more present. More attentive to the inner workings of your own mind. More able to distinguish between signal and noise. Between refined perception and elegant error. Between intuition and cognitive haste. And perhaps the most disconcerting point of all is this. The more you develop this awareness, the less you feel the need for absolute certainty. Doubt ceases to be a threat and becomes an ally. Uncertainty ceases to be an enemy and becomes a natural part of the human journey. This changes everything: decisions, expectations, relationship with the future, and, above all, relationship with oneself. This isn't a definitive answer. It's not a final verdict on what you feel. It's an opening. An invitation to continuous observation. Because, at its core, the question was never whether intuition exists or not. The real question is, are you willing to look at what you feel without immediately converting it into truth? And when that question begins to echo, something rearranges itself inside. Certainty loses its rigidity. Curiosity gains ground. And the mind begins to prepare itself to see even deeper layers of this silent workings that guide so many thoughts, emotions, and decisions. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after everything we've covered so far, the question inevitably begins to shift. Initially, it seemed that the central issue was understanding. What something will happen. Then we start questioning as the brain constructs the sensation. But at some point in this journey, something shifts. Curiosity ceases to be directed towards the future and begins to look inward. And that's when a much more disconcerting reflection arises. Perhaps the question isn't, will this happen? But, why does my brain want to believe so badly that it will? This shift in focus is subtle yet powerful. Because it removes the weight of prediction and sheds light on the inner need. On the almost automatic impulse to close stories, to reduce uncertainties, to transform possibilities into certainties just to alleviate the tension of not knowing. The brain doesn't seek the future because it's fascinating. It seeks the future because the present, when too uncertain, becomes uncomfortable. Throughout this conversation, it became clear that this feeling doesn't arise from nothing. It's built, layer by layer. Emotions amplify weak signals. Selective memories reinforce convenient narratives. Mental shortcuts transform probabilities into convictions. And when all of this comes together, the result isn't doubt, it's a certainty felt throughout the entire body. What's most intriguing is realizing that this certainty is rarely in service of truth. It's in service of relief. Relief from anxiety. Relief from fear. Relief from the feeling of lack of control. The brain prefers an imperfect story to a narrative void. It prefers an imagined future to an undefined present. And this explains why the feeling of "this will happen" seems so urgent, so compelling, and often so impossible to ignore. This understanding changes the emotional impact of everything. Because when you realize that the brain wants to believe, you stop treating the feeling as an external message and start seeing it as an internal movement. A legitimate, human, understandable movement, but not absolute. This doesn't invalidate what you feel. It just repositions it. At this point, something interesting happens in your mindset. The need for certainty begins to lose its power. Not because you've become indifferent or cold, but because you understand the cost of blindly obeying every inner conviction. You begin to realize how many decisions were made more to silence anxiety than to respond to reality. How many choices were guided by the fear of what if instead of the clarity of what is. This awareness doesn't provide ready-made answers. It creates space. Space to breathe before reacting. Space to observe before concluding. Space to recognize that not every feeling needs to become an immediate decision. And this space is transformative because it restores something that seemed lost: autonomy. From that point on, the journey ceases to be about predicting the future and becomes about understanding the inner workings of one's own mind. About noticing when the brain is trying to protect you, even if, to do so, it needs to distort the narrative. About recognizing that many of the strongest certainties were born not from reality, but from discomfort with uncertainty. This type of awareness doesn't eliminate brain error. It continues to exist, but it ceases to operate in the dark. And everything that emerges from the darkness loses some of the power it had. The feeling of "this will happen" may still appear, but now it comes accompanied by a silent question. Is this a sign, or is it just my brain trying to close the story too soon? That question in itself changes everything. It doesn't deny. It doesn't confront. It observes. And observation is the first step in any real transformation. Because when you observe, you don't have to fight against the mind. You begin to understand it. And perhaps that's the true impact of all this reflection. Not discovering whether the hunch was right or wrong, but realizing how much the brain works behind the scenes to sustain a narrative that makes you feel safe, coherent, and in control. Even when that doesn't correspond to external reality. This is not a definitive conclusion. It's a point of maturity on the journey. A point where you no longer need absolute certainties to move forward. A point where doubt ceases to be the enemy and becomes part of the path. A point where the future doesn't need to be predicted for the present to be lived with more clarity. And from here, what begins to be revealed is not only how the brain creates these sensations, but what happens when you stop obeying them automatically, and begin to see with greater depth the invisible patterns that shape thoughts, emotions, and decisions far beyond what appears at first glance. Comment below, that makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, something has probably been echoing inside you. Maybe not a definitive answer, but a different question than the one that brought you to this video. In the beginning, everything revolved around that strange feeling that something was going to happen. Now perhaps the focus has shifted. Perhaps the unease is no longer in the future, but in the way your mind constructs certainties in the present. If this conversation resonated with you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these experiences, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this dialogue. Not because you need to, but because here we continue exploring these silent zones of the mind, where perception, emotion, and reality don't always walk hand in hand. This space only exists because curious people decide to come back. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. Write something like, "This message was for me." It's not just about marking our presence, it's about registering that this reflection affected you in some way. These comments build a kind of collective map of what we feel but rarely put into words. And if at any point you felt a connection with this idea, liking the video is a simple gesture that helps this type of content continue to reach more people who also silently grapple with these questions. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click on it and continue reading. Sometimes an answer doesn't conclude anything, it simply opens the next layer. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,